Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Armed Services Board rejected Meltech's multi-million-dollar claim, ruling that Fort Meade's updated security rules were sovereign acts, the kind the government issues for everyone, not targeted at a single contract. And even if they weren't, the record showed plenty of unforced errors by the contractor. Today we'll walk through this case, the doctrine at its core, and the practical lessons for contractors working behind the gate, with partner at Haynes Boone, Zach Prince. Zach, it's great to have you on.
Great to be here, Terry.
We have a really interesting case to look at, one that made the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. Tell us how a decision about security changes at an Army base ended up at that court.
Sure. So as a predicate, this is part of, I think there are 15 other appeals, all filed by the same contractor, Meltech, all relating to the same project. This has been going on since at least 2020, probably longer. The board has issued a bunch of decisions on small related issues. It seems pretty apparent that the board is sick of this. They dropped the footnote at the end of one of the decisions last year. I mean, every one of these cases that they filed is about like $10,000 at most. Right? It's aggregates to a large amount for a company, and I get that you'd want to fight about everything when it injures your reputation and has a potentially huge impact. But the board was pretty clear in a footnote they dropped last year in one of the decisions that this is the type of matter that any reasonable group of parties would have resolved through negotiations, the usual give and take that contractors and contracting officers ought to expect. I mean, it was dripping with some pretty stern language, but nonetheless, they pressed forward with yet another part of their case. And here, this was security requirements that changed for this project at Fort Meade.
The key issue here seems to be the sovereign acts doctrine. Talk to us about what that is and how it comes into play here.
Sure. So this is one of those esoteric legal ideas that I think would offend the sensibilities of the average person if they knew about it, but is one of the big blockers for contractors to recover against the government on matters where the government really does cause the contractor to expend significant extra costs. So it has been held that when the government acts in its capacity as the government, is not in its capacity as your contracting counterparty, but as the sovereign ruler. It acts in general for general security reasons, not targeted at a contractor, that the government is immune from paying damages that result. So this came up a lot in COVID-era cases where the government closed bases and closed facilities, and contractors are now on the hook for tons of extra costs that they didn't anticipate. But it also came up in 9/11. The seminal case on this is a case called Connor Brothers Construction, which went to the federal circuit, where a construction company was blocked from access to a facility in Georgia because of extra security post 9/11 for some period of time. It comes up every shutdown, which unfortunately keeps coming up as an issue we have to deal with, where contractors will come up with novel arguments for why they ought to get money. And the government will say, no, because we weren't acting in a contract capacity, we're acting in a sovereign capacity. So this doctrine comes up here because Fort Meade at some point during this construction project enacted a new set of security regulations that the contractor claimed caused a massive set of delays for them. 132 days, they ultimately stated, and $1.7 million in damages. This is by far their biggest claim, by the way. So, and I say they had all these $10,000 claims. Then they have the $1.7 million claim. The government said, no, it doesn't matter that you claim all of these issues were caused by these new security regulations because we were acting in our sovereign capacity.
So if you're a contractor, how can you tell the difference between that sovereign capacity and your contractor partner capacity?
So the way you ought to look at it is whether it's targeted at you, as a single contractor, or maybe even a group of contractors at the same facility. It's possible that you might have that kind of argument where you can parse it finely, versus acting generally for every party who might be coming onto a facility. Or in the broader sense, when you look at the COVID cases, shutdown cases, is the government acting in a general, non-specified way, exercising its police authority or necessary powers to protect public health, things like that, versus are they doing something about this contract, or is it incidental?
I'm speaking with Zach Prince. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. And Zach, this case is curious because even when you get past the sovereign capacity, the board had some particular comments on Meltec's own response to these challenges, right?
Yeah, they did. The sovereign acts doctrine was discussed here, and it's important, I think, for folks to remember this, particularly as we keep coming to more shutdowns where this comes up. But really, it didn't turn on this. The board dealt with it first, and they said, because of sovereign acts, we don't really need to deal with whether the government was acting reasonably and whether you, Meltec, really suffered these damages. But then they did anyway. The board then said, but in any case, all the evidence that we've heard, and they had a multi-day hearing on this, showed that the government rolled out these security procedures carefully with real thought, where they helped hold the hands of any contractors that needed it to get access for their individuals. They extended existing base passes to the extent necessary. They gave temporary passes to get onto the facilities to the extent necessary. And still, Meltec could not submit security packages that were complete and accurate. And so they kept having delays that were their own fault. So the board really had no compunctions about raking Meltec over the coals on this one. And given the facts that the board weighed and saw here, yeah, I understand why they did that.
Military bases are prone to changes in security protocols for all kinds of reasons. And as you've just mentioned, shutdowns and other sorts of events can actually close those bases. If you're a contractor working on a military base, what does this case tell you ought to have in the front of your mind all the time?
You ought to always remember that you are, in fact, working at a military base and that they will have these procedures. And it sounds like some of Meltec's subcontractors were putting people forward for security background checks that would never pass a background check. I mean, people who had criminal records or had obvious character defect issues that they ought to have done some vetting. So if you're doing a project, particularly at Fort Meade, you ought to know that this is the context of what we're doing. We're working on a very secure military base. We have to have someone who's checking to ensure that we're complying with security requirements, which can change. And if they change, you have to be able to pivot and make sure that the people you're hiring are able to be admitted.
And thinking about it also from the government side, how should agencies think about preparing for these events and what kind of notice they need to give to contractors who might find themselves sort of in Meltec's situation?
You know, the fact is, I think that the government did what it was supposed to here. This might be a good case for the government to look to, or this is what we ought to do. They gave advance notice of about a month with very detailed, frequently asked questions and procedures, giving multiple phone numbers to be able to call for questions. They worked with all the contractors, taking into consideration who needed priority in analyzing and granting an approval. This was a great job from the government, at least from all the testimony the board relates.
So it's a matter of trying to make sure you never get mentioned in a footnote.
That's right. I mean, that's the other part that I'm sure there's reasons that were going on in the background for why the Corps didn't just settle this. I mean, I think this particular appeal with $1.7 million saw it probably would have stuck in the craw of the Corps when it seemed very obviously, based on the testimony here, that Meltec screwed this up and they were still having the gall of trying to get a bunch of money. But a lot of the other parts of this case seem like they were teeny things that the government just wasted resources by fighting. And you have to really keep in mind the big picture when you're deciding whether to settle a matter. I know it's not easy for government counsel because they're beholden to contracting officers who may or may not have strong personalities. But you've just got to think big picture about whether things are worth the resource investment.
I've been speaking with Zach Prince. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Zach, thanks for bringing this case to us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, in 2026, law enforcement hiring isn't a staffing challenge. It's a risk management challenge hiding inside a staffing challenge. But first, centralization of technology services isn't just happening at the federal level. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Katie Savage is bucking the trend as the Maryland State Government's Chief Information Officer. Where so many federal and state agencies are centralizing technology management roles, Savage, who joined Maryland as its Secretary of IT 3 years ago, is putting CIOs back in state agencies. For more on the approach she calls thoughtful centralization, Savage sat down with Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller on his Ask the CIO show.
One of the things I did in coming into this role is standing up a IT council. So all of the CIOs and IT leaders from the various agencies come together quarterly. And we do a lot of work to survey them and to understand, what are the systems that you wish were centralized? And that gives us, a bit of a roadmap. Are we looking at, is the biggest problem case management? Is it grants management? Is it HR systems? One of the areas where we actually started, because it was honestly, my organization's biggest problem was security and identity and access management. When I started at the state, we had 13 different active directories, which sort of defeats the purpose of an active directory. It's kind of like the foundation for your security, but also how you ultimately try to provision licenses and do lifecycle management for various software. So that was an initiative of thoughtful centralization. Likewise, we had agencies with their own security stack. We had duplicative tools in our cybersecurity stack. And so we really took a hard look at, how we could consolidate our tooling, and which tools were really the most needed, and then worked with the agencies to adopt them. So thoughtful centralization, working with our customers at the various agencies is probably the primary theme. The second, as you were mentioning, is this idea of agency capacity. I've worked with several of the agencies at this point to hire their own CIOs, to hire, chief information officers, to hire CISOs, to hire product managers when there's a system, for example, that rises to the occasion. A good example is the Department of General Services. We worked with them to help recruit a product manager for their e-procurement system, because that's something that, perfect example, it's not going away. There's going to be lots of rules and regulations that change as we work on procurement reform, and we need that role. So really getting capacity at the agencies. Also, that extends to areas like data and privacy and security. So we also need expertise in those areas at the agencies. And then the third is user-centered design. And it's not only, continuing, as I mentioned earlier, to be sort of outcomes driven and begin with the end customer in mind, but it's also about changing my organization's orientation from internal to the state, which will continue to be our primary customer, but also thinking about, how my organization as a Department of IT is more broadly serving Maryland. So a few examples of that, we have, under my portfolio, Network Maryland, which is, our internet network. And, we have historically sort of been focused on, serving fiber to various buildings, state buildings. And that continues to be super important. But, it's this incredible asset, and I would love for us to be more of a player in last mile delivery to residents and businesses. Can we be last mile or at least middle mile so that ISPs can extend, building off of Network Maryland infrastructure, get broadband to more people, again, going back to the Maryland Digital Service, we think about how some of the tools that they are building, our websites are a great example. I think when we started, we had 800 websites and, on an old platform, and we're working to re-platform, but also to reconfigure, again, not just replicating that structure, but making the Maryland.gov experience truly a unified experience versus, a collection of 800 websites. So a lot of what, we've written in the IT master plan is about, focusing on the end user and a better experience, a digital, more connected accessible, secure experience for Marylanders.
I'm surprised that you took the approach of saying, let's get CIOs and CISOs in each of these agencies. Usually you see the opposite. The trend has been over the years is to reduce the number of people with that title, right? You could have lead IT managers, you could have associate CIOs. What made you decide that you're bucking a trend? I mean, maybe that's not unusual for UKD. You were at Defense Digital Service. That's what you guys were all about. But what made you to say that's the better approach versus 801 other approaches?
I mean, when you look at, the Department of Human Services, for example, I mean, that is a massive organization. And they, or the Department of Health, for example, they have interfaces with, the hospital system. And these are massive enterprises, and there will be components of their IT that I can and do want them to consume from us. I don't want them to build their own network. That would probably be confusing. Going back to some of the identity and security tools, we have a mandate from the legislature to have centralized cybersecurity. So those are things I want to be central, but there is also a world where they have, bespoke products that are not extensible to other agencies, are unique to their mission. And I would rather have them have leadership who can do those things really well. So it's been a conversation with them about, what are shared, it's revisiting the shared services model. What are the shared services that it makes sense for a central IT agency to have? And then what are the things that, are so unique to their mission that they need to be able to operate, and it doesn't make sense for me to own. And so it's really revisiting and being flexible on what the shared services model is.
I'm fascinated by the fact that shared services has come back around, right? Like back in the early 2000s, I'm old enough to remember when the second Bush administration, talked about we're going to centralize HR, financial management, and they really struggled to do it. There's been talk about it over the years through the Obama administration to the first Trump administration. And now we've come back around to say, hey, maybe this does make more sense. So you mentioned identity and access management as one. You mentioned cybersecurity as another.
Yeah.
How many centralized services do you think you'll end up with? I mean, maybe that's not a finite number, meaning 10 is our goal or 40 is our goal. But in the short term, what are some of those other things you're centralizing, and what are the things that you're saying, we're just going to set guardrails. So if you buy a system for X, here's the guardrails you need to fit in.
There's kind of two ends of the spectrum. I'm trying to make it easier for people in the state to consume like SaaS products, for example. That's an example of where it's less of a control thing, but honestly, it's just with procurement being, challenging. We want to offer a set of centralized solutions for agencies to be able to, all buy the same CRM system or all buy the same collaboration suite. So there's, that also allows us to do sort of like life cycle management and things like that. So on one end of the spectrum, it's really like, let's have a central repository. But the more important focus for me, in terms of shared services, are really like these big pieces of infrastructure that we want to invest in. And I'll give a few examples of that. So, one example, as I mentioned earlier, is Network Maryland. We actually have two networks. We have the fiber network and we have the radio network. So that's like big infrastructure that, in the case of our radio program, all first responders in Maryland leverage that. So that's something that, is an investment that we're making so that many, many agencies and municipalities and localities don't have to. Likewise, earlier this summer, we transitioned the platform formerly known as MD Think, now Maryland Benefits, to do it. And the reason for that is because we really see the opportunity for some of the infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure that we've built there, to be extensible to other agencies. I'd love to be able to offer platform as a service to some of these agencies that similarly have really big programs to build. Department of Labor, for example, is working on paid family leave. And that's an opportunity, they're going to have to build something. It's an opportunity to think about, like, how can we provision an environment for them?
Katie Savage is the Secretary of Information Technology for Maryland, speaking there with Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. You can find the full interview at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search Ask the CIO. Coming up next, in 2026, law enforcement hiring isn't a staffing challenge. It's a risk management challenge hiding inside a staffing challenge. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As law enforcement agencies at every level scale up recruiting, legacy background tools can't track officer movement or surface red flags early enough to matter. Joining me to explain why those gaps show up first in hiring and what a modern shared digital platform would let agencies see that they can't today is the founder of Guardian Alliance Technologies, Justin Bettinger. Justin, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Hi, Terry. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Our federal law enforcement agencies right now are in the midst of what we might call a hiring frenzy, trying to add tens of thousands of positions. You specialize in law enforcement background checks. So what is most challenging about our current background investigation system when agencies are facing these massive hiring efforts?
Well, as these efforts are actually across the whole nation, as far as local, federal, and state, the biggest crisis that we face is just doing things the same way that we've done them. We haven't updated this space. We haven't made it more efficient. So it's very outdated, and they're using a lot of paperwork, binders to house these background investigations as far as all the information. Because we collect a lot of information during a law enforcement background. We're collecting references, neighbors, a ton of information. One binder could hold 300 to 350 pages of information. So we just haven't made it more efficient, and we haven't brought it into the digital world yet, federal, state, and local.
What would an updated system even look like?
An updated system would just be way more efficient as far as right now, a lot of agencies are sending out mailers as far as licking stamps and envelopes and sending out to reference. Well, in a digital system, that system automatically sends stuff out. The applicant fills out their personal history questionnaire, and a lot of our information is derived from that. So the applicant's telling us where to send this stuff. But right now we're doing it with mail, phone calls, where AI, digital systems just improve the efficiency, and it takes the bias out of a background investigation.
Talk to me more about how that anti-bias provisions would work.
As far as just people, maybe profiling an applicant, or he won't be good. This is fine. This happened, but this is okay. Well, the AI and the digital world, we don't care how somebody answers or don't answer. It's the same, and that's what we're here at Guardian Alliance Technologies. That's what I was always trying to do, was provide efficiency, but also make everything kind of the same as far as a background investigation. Because right now it's so different across everywhere.
When you think about law enforcement investigations, I would imagine, like in some other special fields, the people who are doing the screening feel like they bring a lot of expertise to this process. How do you balance that I want to be involved, I need to see them face-to-face approach with the efficiencies that you'd argue for in a more digital format?
100%. The digital world is not going to replace the background investigator, because you're absolutely right. The face-to-face is so important to get to know that person. The inefficiency is just a lot of the paperwork, a lot of the emailing, a lot of the talk, the interviews, as far as we do interviews with these applicants, where AI can help digest those interviews and bring out stuff. We also have red flags in our system, where if an applicant answers a question that he did drugs 6 months ago, it'll red flag it and automatically DQ him or disqualify an applicant, where it's just basically you're bringing an applicant to an investigator that's ready to go and that's been kind of vetted by our system or by a digital system. And it just improves the time and efficiency for a background investigator. But you're right. We'll never take away the background investigator.
You just mentioned red flags. When you're in a predominantly paper-based process, what kinds of past misconduct or employment history issues do people commonly miss?
Well, we've seen a lot of things missed, and we've helped agencies all over this. We're in 49 states with our software, so we've helped agencies all over the nation improve this process. But we've had an officer drive on a suspended license. We've missed social media screening now that we do social media because of the new tech out there. So we do a social media screen where agencies weren't doing that before. So we missed stuff on social media that could be, very, damaging to an agency if found.
What kind of risks does an agency face, or might an agency face, if they do miss some of these red flags? Does it turn into litigation or decertification or something?
Absolutely, it could turn into litigation. It could. We've seen that in the past, and for a very low cost of using the digital and keeping everything organized, it's very cost effective to do it digitally and to help the investigator because lawsuits, decertification, firings, lack of trust in the community now, which is I think one of the biggest things. I think we improve the trust in the community when we're using it digital. We're doing everything we can to make sure we have the best officers on the street. And that's really my goal, to put the best officers on the street.
I'm speaking with Justin Bettinger. He's the founder of Guardian Alliance Technologies. So, Justin, what is keeping law enforcement agencies from adopting a more modern approach to these kinds of background checks?
Well, to be truthful, Terry, just like everything, it's just the answers we get sometimes is just that's the way we've always done it. So it's just a lack of knowledge, a lack of which we're out there trying to improve. But some people in the government world, they get comfortable, and change is sometimes a bad thing in that world. So we're out there doing campaigns and make sure we can get everybody to adopt it that we can.
One of the issues that you've raised is the loss of information when law enforcement officers transfer, maybe between other branches or other agencies or other localities. Talk to me about what that risk entails and how a more digital approach might help solve that.
Yeah, absolutely. We call that the wandering officer. Like they could get fired, they could quit in lieu of and go somewhere else. And our digital system tracks those officers. They track an applicant. So if an applicant answers a question somewhere, gets disqualified and goes somewhere else, we're able to track that. Where right now we're in a paper world, we can't track that. Maybe an email, maybe though. So the tracking is way better. We're a part of the NDI, which is the National Decertification Index, which hopefully all states will get on board. And that is basically an index, a database that you can check to see if a officer has been decertified. So you can check those, because as we've seen in the past, we've seen officers go somewhere else, get in trouble, and should have never been hired in the first place. So we're trying to do a better job of tracking and following that officer and make sure that he's good.
Any concerns inside that digital tracking process about individual privacy and privacy violations?
No, because they do a file review and they'll do all that anyway. So a lot of these law enforcement officers, as far as what we do, is they have a waiver that everybody signs so that people can look at their employment, their past, because being a law enforcement officer is a little different than getting a job at Home Depot or somewhere else. So you do sign away a lot of privacy rights with waivers and stuff for these applicants.
As we're thinking about background checks, I want to ask how background checks relate to security clearances. The federal government has been trying to reform the security clearance process for decades. Is there a path where these two slightly different approaches kind of come together and reinforce each other instead of being separate silos?
Yeah, I think there could be, but we're kind of looking into that too, because we haven't really broken to that federal level yet. As far as they use a system called EQIP, and they're married to that system, as you probably know, right? That EQIP system. We've been trying to break into that a little bit because I think we could do a better job there too, security clearances and the background investigation process, and that takes a long time too. I mean, federal government background investigation for a security clearance, that's a long process too. So I think we could help there, yeah.
Sometimes when agencies are so focused on hiring, it becomes an HR issue, and it's about meeting numerical objectives and less about thinking about the risks of doing some things wrong, or as you've talked about, missing some key information. How do you want the leaders of these organizations to connect those dots?
Yeah, I think that's the fear. That's what keeps me up at night as far as lowering standards to meet ever pressuring type situation. And we've seen that. We've seen it across the country. We've lowered. I mean, California has, marijuana is okay. they've lowered that standard, and cops can smoke the day before they come into a test now if they want to be a cop. And I just think, I don't know, I believe that's a dangerous situation right there, because I think police officers should be held to a way higher standard than, I mean, you're taking people's, freedom, and you're way higher standard than the normal citizen.
And for these federal agencies that are under such pressure right now to hire fast, what caution or what piece of advice would you want to make sure they take on board?
Just that, as far as the lowering the standards, just make sure we can hire fast, but we still need to do a good job in vetting. And I think they try to do the best they can, but I just think with the digital world and the AI now, we can do a lot better job without, like you said, taking that human element out of it, the background investigator. Like my software was never meant to replace the background investigator. It was just it's another tool in the arsenal to try to make sure we get great cops on the street.
I've been speaking with Justin Bettinger. He's the founder of Guardian Alliance Technologies. I really appreciate you sort of raising our awareness of this challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, Terry. Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The full impact of continuing resolutions is hard to pin down for the Defense Department, but a government watchdog says the funding lapses consistently lead to delays, higher costs, added administrative work, and operational disruptions, including a facility sustainment contract at Joint Base San Antonio that more than doubled after CR-related delays. They also disrupted training and exercises and forced financial staff to rework budgets to navigate CR limits instead of supporting the mission. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Rashmi Agarwal, a director on the Government Accountability Office's Defense Capabilities and Management team.
We were requested by Congress through a provision in the Senate report accompanying the NDAA to really understand what were the specific effects of CRs on DoD operation and maintenance activities and acquisition programs. So this report really describes the effects of selected DoD activities and programs, and we do a deep dive into those particular activities and programs.
How did you decide what activities and programs to include in this sample? Because you're only looking at certain programs here.
Given kind of the direction that we had in the provision that I mentioned, we selected a sample of operation and maintenance activities and acquisition programs that we determined were likely to be affected by CRs and that were aligned with DoD's strategic priorities. So our goal was in selecting these activities and programs was to provide illustrative examples of how DoD activities and programs were specifically affected by CRs. And so these selected activities and programs are critical to DoD's national security mission.
Let's dive into those examples. Could you first talk about some of those activities and programs that you surveyed that were impacted by CRs? But also, did you find that some programs were maybe insulated from the impacts of CRs?
Let me give you some context. In terms of the types of operations and maintenance activities we reviewed, we looked at things like facilities, sustainment, joint exercises, and unit training. And in terms of the acquisition programs, we looked at things including Air Force aircraft, Army ammunition, and Space Force and Navy missile defense systems. So we did find that while the effects vary, nearly every activity and program we reviewed experienced some sort of effect. It could be a direct effect or an indirect effect from CRs. So acquisition programs face really direct constraints. So not just being held to prior year funding levels, but also not being able to start new programs or make changes to things like production rates. Additionally, some of the operation and maintenance activities we looked at, like facilities and maintenance, also faced more significant constraints like from the CR. So for example, Navy officials that said CRs led to delays in awarding Navy ship maintenance contracts. And Army officials we spoke with said there were delays in the work at Army maintenance depots.
Is there a mechanism by which you could measure which programs are most affected?
That is a really good question because available data really were not available and do not allow for a precise measure of the extent of the effects of CRs on DoD operations in many cases. So where we could find specific examples, for example, with contract costs, we included that information.
As for contract costs, could you talk about what are some of the primary drivers of those cost increases when DoD operates under a CR?
We found that, those cost increases can come from a variety of sources. So for some of the acquisition programs, CRs led to placing smaller orders over the course of the year and not being able to take advantage of better pricing. In addition, there could be increased costs due to inflation, changes in foreign exchange rates, or vendors just needing more time to complete work in a compressed time frame. So, for example, officials that we talked to at Joint Base San Antonio reported that CR delays led to an average increased contract cost of 66%, including some projects where the cost more than doubled.
There are also spending challenges. Could you talk about which programs were most affected there? What did you find there?
I think the main takeaway there is that CRs can lead to uneven spending over the course of the fiscal year. So CRs create uncertainty for agencies about when they're going to receive their final appropriation and also what the final funding amount is going to be and how much funding is going to be available to them. So what we were finding is that as a result of CRs, spending is often more limited earlier in the fiscal year simply because they just don't know how much funding they have. And then it has to increase later in the fiscal year after a regular appropriation passes. So when that happens, we found that, activities and programs can still face constraints in being able to spend the funding that they have available. So, for example, going back to contracting, the contracting offices may not have the capacity to solicit and award all the contracts that need to be awarded, or vendors may not have the capacity to complete all the projects that need to be completed.
The Defense Department operated under a full-year continuing resolution last year. How did operating under a full-year CR impact the Defense Department in comparison to operating under a short-term CR?
For the scope of our review, we did not look specifically at how a full-year CR affected the department. It wasn't within the time frame of our review, but our report does note some of the ways that last year's full-year CR differed from traditional CRs, including the ability to have new starts. That is not typical under a traditional CR, but that was available to the department last year. We did look at the differences between shorter and longer CR periods and found that longer CR periods, so those would be periods that last 3 months or longer of the fiscal year, led to slower obligation rates, meaning they couldn't commit to spending as quickly early on in the fiscal year, specifically, I would say, for acquisition-related appropriations. So that means that when these programs received a regular appropriation, they had a shorter time frame to obligate the rest of their funding by the end of the fiscal year. Longer CRs also then tend to amplify some of the challenges that I talked about earlier with bottlenecks that programs and activities face as they're hitting that end of the fiscal year timeline. So like I mentioned before, time for awarding contracts and vendors being able to complete activities, that time frame is compressed.
Based on the work that you've done here, what are some additional reporting mechanisms that could enable a more comprehensive assessment of CR-related impacts across the department?
I think if the department takes action on the DoD Inspector General's recommendation, they are going to obtain that data, whether it's cost data in terms of the contracts that got extended as a result of CRs, for example. But I think if they take action on that recommendation, that would enable a better assessment of the CR-related impacts.
That's the Government Accountability Office's Rashmi Agarwal speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find Anastasia's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.